That day I went to my son's house without calling first. I heard voices from the living room and recognized my daughter-in-law's. "Get out of here, you crazy old woman!" she yelled with contempt. My wife, her eyes full of tears, just lowered her head. She didn't know I was behind the door, listening to every word. I waited a few seconds. Then I walked in. You know, there are moments in life that define you, not necessarily the big achievements or the celebrations. Sometimes it's a few seconds of quiet where you decide who you really are. Those brief moments where your true character is revealed by how you respond to an unexpected situation. For me, that moment came at 65 years old. It was as if time stopped while I processed what I had just heard. The words from Claire, my daughter-in-law, echoed in my ears. I watched through the cracked open door as my Helen, my partner of 42 years, stood motionless. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, enduring a humiliation she never should have experienced. I felt an intense heat rising in my chest, a mix of outrage and shame. Outrage for the treatment of the woman who had given everything for our family. Shame for not recognizing the signs sooner, for letting it get to this point. I could have burst in immediately, consumed by anger. I could have made a scene, yelled, demanded respect, but something inside me, maybe the wisdom gathered over 6.5 decades, made me hold my breath and think, this would not be an impulsive reaction. It would be a calculated, dignified, and definitive response. I took a deep breath, adjusted the collar of my shirt, and gently pushed the door open. My name is Richard Foster. I was born in a small town in the heartland, the son of an elementary school teacher and a nurse. I grew up valuing education, honest work, and respect for others, especially my elders. My father, Mark, always said, "The measure of a man is not in what he accumulates, but in how he treats those who can give him nothing in return." With effort and determination, I managed to get into a top state university to study civil engineering. Those were years of sacrifice. I shared a tiny apartment with 3 other students. I worked as a waiter at night and studied during every free moment I found. But I never complained. I understood I was building the foundation of my future. After graduating, I was lucky enough to get a job at Valley Developers, a medium-sized but respected company. For 3 years, I learned every aspect of the business, from supervising job sites to reviewing contracts and negotiating with suppliers. My boss, Mr. Henry Valdez, became my mentor, recognizing my dedication and my ability to solve complex problems. When Mr. Valdez decided to expand the company to a growing city, he offered to let me run the new office. I was only 28, and the responsibility was enormous, but I accepted the challenge. It was there, while organizing an event for potential clients, that I met Helen Miller, a beautiful 5-year-old woman who worked at a local art gallery. Our courtship was brief but intense. In Helen, I found not only beauty, but a sharp intelligence and artistic sensibility that perfectly complemented my more pragmatic approach. We married a year after we met in a simple but emotional ceremony at the city cathedral. The first few years were filled with constant work and shared dreams. Helen left her job at the gallery to help me make connections with potential clients, organizing dinners and events that gradually built our professional network. Her exquisite taste and natural warmth drew people in a way that I, being more reserved by nature, could never have achieved alone. When Mr. Valdez faced health problems 5 years later, he offered me the chance to buy his share of the company. "I don't have children, Richard, and I don't know anyone who would take care of this business like you would," he told me from his hospital bed. With a substantial loan and all our savings, Helen and I became the majority owners of Valley Developers. The next 15 years were ones of steady growth. We expanded operations to 3 more states, diversified into real estate development, and specialized in high-end commercial and tourism projects. The work was exhausting but rewarding. I often spent weeks away from home, supervising projects in different cities, negotiating with investors, solving crises. Helen, meanwhile, became the heart of our home and a fundamental presence in the company. She handled public relations, personally decorated our model properties, and maintained a social network that frequently resulted in new contracts. When our son Daniel was born, after 7 years of marriage, she reorganized her life to balance motherhood with supporting our ventures. Daniel grew up in an environment of material comfort but also solid values. From a young age, we took him to the construction sites, We taught him the importance of a job well done and instilled in him respect for everyone, from the construction worker to the investor. He was a bright, charismatic boy, full of curiosity and energy. "He will be a great leader someday," Helen would comment, as we watched him interact with the workers, asking questions, learning names, showing that natural empathy he had inherited from his mother. When it was time to choose a university, I wasn't surprised that he decided on business administration instead of engineering. "Dad, you already built the structure," he told me with that confidence he always had. "I'll take charge of bringing it to the next level." We supported his decision, funding his studies at a prestigious private university in New York. During those years, Helen and I began to enjoy the fruits of decades of work. We bought a larger house in an exclusive area of the city. We started traveling internationally, and we began to consider an eventual transition that would allow us to enjoy more and work less. Daniel graduated with honors, and just as we had hoped, he showed a natural talent for business. After working for 2 years at an international consulting firm, he returned to our city to join the family business. His fresh vision, combined with valuable contacts developed during his time at the firm, brought new energy to Valley developers. It was during this time that he met Claire Hayes, the daughter of a local politician with considerable influence. Beautiful, educated abroad, always impeccably dressed, and with an air of sophistication that commanded attention, Claire seemed like the perfect match for an ambitious young businessman like my son. However, from our very first meeting, something about her gave me a subtle unease that I couldn't fully explain. Maybe it was the calculating way she sized up our house during that first dinner, or how her smile never seemed to reach her eyes, or the way she subtly steered every conversation toward topics of status and social connections. "You're being unfair," Helen told me when I mentioned my reservations. "She's just nervous about meeting us. It's natural that she wants to make a good impression." I accepted her perspective, recognizing that maybe my worries were exaggerated or based on unfair judgments. After all, Helen had always been better than me at judging people's character, and Daniel seemed genuinely happy. He was more motivated than ever, excited about the future he was building. They married a year later in a lavish ceremony that frankly seemed excessive to me. 400 guests, many of whom Helen and I didn't even know. Extravagant decorations, international entertainment, a reception that seemed designed more to impress than to celebrate a genuine love. But again I reminded myself that these were different times, that every generation has its own way of doing things. As a wedding gift, we gave them the deed to a house in an exclusive development that our company had recently built. I also offered Daniel an executive position in the company, intending to start a gradual transition that would eventually position him as CEO. The problem started subtly. Small changes in family dynamics that were initially easy to justify or ignore. The Sunday visits, a tradition we had kept since Daniel went to college, started to become less frequent. When they did come, Claire frequently found excuses to arrive late or leave early. "She has important social commitments," Daniel would explain, "relationships that will eventually benefit the company." Special occasions, birthdays, anniversaries, traditional family celebrations, gradually became minefields of subtle tensions. Apparently innocent comments from Claire about the outdated decor in our house, questions about when we planned to modernize a bit, observations about how other business families managed their affairs. Helen, always diplomatic, responded with kindness or simply let the comments pass. I, recognizing the importance of keeping family peace, followed her lead, even though these displays of barely veiled condescension irritated me more and more. In the business, Daniel began to propose significant changes, aggressive expansion into new markets, investments in sectors he considered more prestigious, restructuring the management team to bring in new blood. Some ideas had merit, and we implemented them successfully. Others seemed driven more by appearances than by financial soundness. "We need to project a more cosmopolitan image, Dad," he insisted in our executive meetings. "The world has changed. We can't keep operating like a provincial company if we want to attract a certain level of clients and investors. Our reputation for solidity and reliability is what got us here," I would remind him. "Valley Developers means guaranteed quality, on-time delivery, fair price. We shouldn't sacrifice that identity for superficial appearances." These professional differences, normal between generations, gradually began to tint our personal relationship. Daniel consulted my opinions less and less, implementing changes without prior discussion, presenting me with done deals instead of proposals to consider. Helen's role in the company also began to shrink, though in ways so subtle that we barely noticed at first. Meetings scheduled when she had other commitments, responsibilities reassigned to younger executives. Her office relocated to a smaller space, further from the center of operations. These are logical changes, she would tell me, always willing to see the best in situations. Daniel is taking the reins, just like we always wanted. It's natural for him to want to implement his own vision with his own team. However, the turning point came during the party for the company's 10th anniversary under my leadership. A significant event we had planned carefully to recognize longtime employees, celebrate milestones, and officially announce the start of the transition to Daniel's leadership. Helen had worked for weeks on the preparations, personally selecting every detail, from the venue to the menu, the music, the awards for each outstanding employee. The celebration was meant to be a reflection of the values that had built the company: warmth, recognition of effort, gratitude toward those who had contributed to our success. 2 days before the event, Daniel informed us that he had updated several aspects of the celebration. He changed the location from a traditional hall with historical meaning for us to an ultra-modern hotel that had just opened. He modified the format to include a fashion show sponsored by exclusive boutiques where Claire had connections. He reduced the time dedicated to employee recognition to make more space for strategic contacts Claire had invited without consulting us. "It's a marketing opportunity, Dad," he explained when I expressed my confusion. "We need to use this moment to reposition the brand, not just to pat people on the back." "Those pats on the back, as you call them, are recognitions for people who have dedicated decades to building this company," I replied, holding back my frustration. "People without whom neither you nor I would have anything to celebrate." "Of course we value them," Claire chimed in, with that condescending tone she had perfected. "But we also have to look to the future, connect with a certain level of influencers, attract a higher profile of investors." Helen, noticing the growing tension, tried to mediate. "Maybe we can find a balance, keep the meaningful recognitions while incorporating some new elements." "It's all organized," Claire cut in. "The contracts are signed, the invitations are sent. It would be a logistical disaster to change now. Besides," she added with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "trust us. It will be a much more impactful event than what you had imagined." The event was indeed impactful, but not in the way we would have wanted. The celebration turned into a showcase of superficial excess. The true builders of the company, foremen, engineers, longtime administrators, felt visibly uncomfortable among political influencers and socialites who barely knew our business. The planned recognitions were reduced to a brief mention during a rushed speech, while the fashion show took center stage. The most painful part was seeing Helen, the true architect of our human relationships for decades, relegated to an almost decorative secondary role. Claire dominated the event, implicitly presenting herself as the new face of the company, while Daniel nodded with obvious pride at her prominence. "It's not what we had planned," Helen whispered to me during a quiet moment. "But if this makes Daniel happy and strengthens his position in the company, we should adapt." Her generosity moved me and outraged me at the same time. Helen, always putting others first, always willing to yield for the sake of family harmony. But at what cost was it happening this time? In the months that followed, the family dynamic deteriorated even further. The Sunday visits practically stopped, replaced by brief meetings in restaurants where Claire meticulously controlled the duration and content of our interactions. Phone calls became less frequent and more superficial. Professional consultations became almost non-existent. Helen, always the conciliatory heart of the family, tried to keep the bridges open. She sent loving messages, cooked Daniel's favorite dishes on the rare occasions they visited, showed genuine interest in Claire's new projects, even when they seemed like passing whims rather than serious ventures. In the company, meanwhile, the transition we had imagined as a gradual, collaborative process accelerated without proper consultation. Daniel began to make increasingly significant unilateral decisions. Changes in management teams, new strategic directions, even modifications to the logo and visual identity we had maintained for decades. "These are necessary updates," he would explain in meetings where my opinion was less and less requested. "The market has evolved, and we must evolve with it." I didn't dispute the need for evolution. What worried me was the apparent disconnection from the core values that had built our success. Long-term relationships, unquestionable quality, integrity in every interaction, these seemed to be gradually sacrificed in favor of superficial connections, dazzling appearances, and immediate results. I tried to speak directly with Daniel on several occasions, always in private, always with respect. His responses followed a predictable pattern: superficial acknowledgement of my concerns, followed by explanations of how times have changed and how my vision, while respectable, was outdated for the current environment. "We're not dismantling your legacy, Dad," he assured me during one of these talks. "We are adapting it for a new era." I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. After all, I had worked my entire life precisely for this moment. To hand over a thriving business to my son, to watch it grow under his leadership, to enjoy the fruits of decades of effort while the next generation took the reins. However, a persistent unease stayed with me. It wasn't simple resistance to change or difficulty letting go of control. It was something more fundamental. The feeling that the changes weren't happening organically from Daniel's values, but were being imposed externally, motivated by influences that prioritized appearances over substance. Helen, with her sharp intuition, sensed my worry even though I tried to hide it. "You're worried about the direction the company is taking, aren't you?" she asked me one night as we enjoyed a quiet moment on our patio. "It's not just the company," I confessed. "It's Daniel. I feel like he's pulling away not only from us, but from himself, from the values he grew up with." "Children have to find their own way," she responded with that calm wisdom that had always centered me. "Sometimes that path seems to move away before it comes back to what's essential." "And what if it doesn't come back?" I asked, voicing for the first time the fear that had been growing inside me. "What if the values we passed on are permanently lost under influences that prioritize the superficial?" "Then we will have done the best we could," she replied, taking my hand. "The rest depends on his own choices." Her serenity calmed me temporarily, but the situation continued to deteriorate. In the company, increasingly risky decisions began to be implemented without consulting me properly. Projects started more for prestige than for financial viability. Alliances with partners of questionable reputation but valuable political connections. Significant loans to finance expansions that seemed premature to me. In the family sphere, our presence seemed more like an uncomfortable obligation than a desired connection. In the few meetings we had, Claire dominated the conversations with anecdotes about celebrities she had met, exclusive events they had attended, properties they were considering acquiring. Helen listened with genuine interest, asking polite questions, showing enthusiasm for their achievements. I tried to follow her example, although I found it increasingly difficult to find sincerity in these exchanges that seemed designed more to impress than to connect. The catalyst that finally precipitated the crisis occurred last week. We had been invited at Helen's insistence to a dinner at Daniel and Claire's house to celebrate the acquisition of an important piece of land for a new development. A property that, I must admit, had considerable strategic potential, although the price paid seemed excessive to me. The dinner proceeded with the usual, barely disguised tension under social formalities. Claire dominating the conversation, Daniel seconding her opinions, Helen maintaining a polite interest, me observing and participating minimally. When Claire briefly stepped away to take a call, I took the opportunity to ask Daniel for some financial details about the acquisition that worried me. "The leverage seems excessively risky," I commented, keeping my tone conversational rather than critical, especially considering the current market volatility. "The risk analyses were exhaustive," Daniel replied with some tension. "The potential return on investment more than justifies it. I'd like to review those analyses," I suggested. "Not to obstruct, just to share perspective based on experience with similar situations." "I appreciate the offer, Dad, but we have a top-tier financial team," he replied, clearly uncomfortable with my suggestion. "People who specialize in the current market, not in how things worked decades ago." The comment hurt because of its clear dismissal of my experience. But before I could respond, Claire returned, immediately catching the tension in the air. "More financial questions, Richard?" she asked with a smile that didn't completely hide her irritation. "You should be celebrating this achievement with us, not subjecting every decision to an interrogation." "It's not an interrogation," Helen intervened with her usual diplomacy. It's genuine interest. We're proud of your achievements, and naturally we want to understand the details. What we want to understand, Claire corrected, a barely contained edge in her voice, is why it's so hard for you to just be supportive without constantly questioning. This acquisition is a significant triumph for Daniel, a crucial step in his leadership of the company. No one is questioning the achievement, I tried to clarify. I'm just offering an additional perspective on financial structures I've seen work or fail in similar situations. With all due respect, Claire replied, dropping all pretense of friendliness. The company is evolving beyond antiquated structures. Daniel is implementing contemporary strategies that might be hard for previous generations to understand. Helen, always sensitive to interpersonal dynamics, tried again to diffuse the tension. Each generation brings valuable perspectives. Richard's experience combined with your fresh vision could create a powerful balance. If we were looking for balance with the past, Claire retorted with obvious disdain, we would never move toward the future we deserve. The dinner ended shortly after that, with tense goodbyes and empty promises to talk about it more calmly another time. During the drive home, Helen and I were mostly silent, each processing what had happened. I'm worried, Richard, Helen finally said, as we were getting ready for bed. Not about the professional disagreements, those are natural, but about the personal dynamic that's developing. I feel like we're losing our son, not just professionally, but as a family. I feel it too, I admitted. And what worries me most is that it seems to be happening under an influence that prioritizes appearances over substance, superficial connections over genuine relationships. Do you think we should try to talk to Daniel directly, without Claire present? I've tried that individually several times, I replied. But maybe together, showing a united but loving front, we could have more impact. We agreed to try this approach, and Helen offered to contact Daniel the next day to arrange a meeting. However, before she could, I received an urgent call from Martin Smith, our trusted CFO for over 15 years. Richard, he began with obvious concern, I need to talk to you immediately about some transactions that have been approved in the last few days. There are irregularities that worry me significantly. We arranged a private meeting at his house to avoid speculation at the office. What he revealed left me deeply alarmed. Significant transfers to non-transparent entities, incomplete documentation for substantial loans, collateral committed without proper approvals. I'm not suggesting illegal activity, Martin clarified, but I am suggesting financially reckless practices that put the company's stability at risk. And what particularly worries me is that several of these transactions were signed by Daniel but drafted by third parties who aren't even formally part of the company. Do you have any idea who these third parties are? I can't confirm it officially, he replied with professional caution. But several documents were prepared from an email address associated with the Hayes Group, Claire's father's conglomerate. This information confirmed my worst suspicions. The external influence wasn't just about superficial things like image or social relations. It was penetrating fundamental aspects of the business, potentially compromising its financial and operational integrity. After consulting with Martin about immediate measures to contain potential damage, I decided it was time for a direct intervention. Not scheduled, not filtered through secretaries or assistants, but an honest encounter where I could directly assess the situation and the true dynamics at play. That is how, yesterday afternoon, I drove to Daniel's house without notice. Helen, who had planned to visit him that morning to drop off some important personal documents, decided to accompany me, arguing that a full family approach might be more effective. However, when we arrived, I suggested she go in first while I properly parked the car. It will be less confrontational if we don't show up together unannounced, I explained. You can prepare the ground with your usual tact. She agreed, always trusting my judgment as I trusted hers. I watched her walk toward the main entrance while I maneuvered the vehicle. When I finally approached the house, the front door had been left slightly ajar, and that's when I heard it. Claire's voice, loud and loaded with a contempt she wasn't even trying to hide. "Get out of here, you crazy old woman!" I froze for a moment, trying to process what I had just heard. I moved silently until I could partially see the scene through the open door. My Helen, always dignified, always considerate of everyone, was standing in the middle of the living room. Her head slightly bowed, her hands clutching her purse with a tension that revealed her effort to maintain composure. "I just wanted to talk to Daniel," I heard Helen say, her voice surprisingly firm despite the blatant aggression. These documents are important, and I thought. I don't care what you thought, Claire interrupted. I am sick of your surprise visits, your outdated opinions, your constant attempts to influence my house and my decisions. This is my son's house too, Helen replied, a slight tremble now noticeable in her voice. And these family matters. Family! Claire exclaimed with a derogatory laugh. Do you think I don't see what you're trying to do? Manipulating Daniel with your self-sacrificing mother tactics? Trying to make him question decisions that are finally positioning him where he deserves to be, free from the limitations you two imposed on him for years? We never wanted to limit Daniel, Helen responded, her composure visibly starting to crack. We just want what's best for him, for you, for the legacy we built with so much effort. Legacy? Claire's tone was increasingly aggressive. A provincial company with mediocre aspirations. Daniel deserves much more than that, and he's finally accessing connections and opportunities on a real level, not the crumbs you two settled for. I watched as Helen's eyes filled with tears, not of self-pity, but of disbelief at such a level of contempt for decades of honest work and dedication. Where is Daniel? Helen asked, trying to stay focused on the purpose of her visit. I need to give him these documents personally. He's busy with important matters, Claire replied, her posture clearly intimidating as she advanced toward Helen. Not with sentimental nonsense that can wait, or better yet, be forgotten completely. It was then that I saw him, my son Daniel, partially visible in the hallway leading to the office, watching the scene without intervening. His expression a mixture of discomfort and resignation, complicity? I couldn't be sure, but his inaction while his wife humiliated his mother was as painful to me as Claire's words themselves. I'll tell you one last time, Claire continued, her tone now openly threatening. Get out of here, you crazy old woman. And the next time you want to communicate with my husband, do it through the proper channels. You no longer have the right to burst into our lives whenever you please, imposing your outdated expectations and your emotional manipulations. Helen, her eyes full of tears, simply lowered her head. Not in submission, but in a silent dignity that broke my heart. She didn't deserve this treatment. Not after everything she had given to our family, to the company, to Daniel himself. She didn't know that I was behind the door, listening to every word. I waited a few seconds, containing the explosive mix of outrage and pain that threatened to overwhelm me. I would not act impulsively. This situation required a measured but definitive response. I took a deep breath, straightened my posture, and gently pushed the door. The door swung open completely, revealing my presence. The silence that followed was absolute, almost tangible. Claire, who seconds before was radiating aggression, froze with an expression that fluctuated between surprise and a failed attempt at immediate composure. Helen turned slowly, relief mixing with embarrassment in her eyes when she saw me. And Daniel, my son, emerged completely from the hallway, his face turning pale as he realized I had been a witness to the entire thing. "Richard," Claire stammered, her voice suddenly modulated into a false cordiality. "We didn't know you were coming." "What a surprise." "Unexpected," I completed, my voice perfectly controlled as I walked over to Helen. I put my arm protectively around my wife's shoulders, feeling her slight tremor under my touch. There had been very few times in our 4 decades together that I had needed to defend her. Helen had always been perfectly capable of handling difficult situations with a grace and diplomacy I deeply admired. But this was different. This time they had crossed a line I never imagined possible. "Dad," Daniel intervened, stepping forward with an expression that tried to be conciliatory. "There was a misunderstanding. Mom arrived at a complicated moment and—" "There was no misunderstanding," I interrupted firmly. "I heard everything, Daniel. Every single word." The room seemed to shrink with the tension. Claire adjusted her posture, as if preparing for a confrontation, while Daniel seemed to shrink slightly. "Maybe I exaggerated a little," Claire offered with a forced smile. "It's been a stressful week with the new project, and I overreacted. Of course, Helen is always welcome in our home." The falseness of her apology was so obvious it was almost insulting. It wasn't regret I saw in her eyes, but calculation, damage control, searching for the most effective strategy to neutralize this unexpected situation. "We're leaving," I said simply. My decision already made. "Helen, dear, did you bring the documents you mentioned?" Helen, gradually regaining her composure, nodded, and took an envelope from her purse. They are the original stock certificates that were in Daniel's name, she explained, her voice soft but firm. We needed him to sign the transfer for the new family trust we are setting up. Leave them on the table, I instructed. Daniel can review them when he has time for sentimental nonsense, as his wife called it. Daniel took a step forward, his expression now visibly worried. Dad, this is ridiculous. We can talk like adults about what happened. There's no need to. Talk like adults? I repeated, letting a touch of disbelief seep into my voice. An adult would have intervened immediately when his wife treated his mother that way. An adult would have set clear boundaries about fundamental respect in his home, regardless of disagreements or tensions. You're exaggerating the situation, he insisted, his tone mixing defensiveness with an attempt at appeasement. It was a heated exchange, nothing more. We all say things in the heat of the moment that don't reflect our true feelings. I looked directly at my son, searching his eyes for something of the boy I had raised, of the young man in whom I had placed not only professional hopes, but fundamental human values. What I found was disturbing. A mix of calculations similar to Claire's, concern for the practical consequences rather than the emotional damage caused. And something else, something that almost looked like relief that this confrontation had finally happened, as if he had been holding back this explosion for a long time. You're right about one thing, Daniel, I replied after a few moments. Words spoken in intense moments sometimes reveal deeper truths than those carefully rehearsed in controlled circumstances. I turned to Claire, who was maintaining that tense smile that never reached her eyes. What I heard today was not a misunderstanding or an overreaction. It was the clear articulation of a contempt that you have obviously cultivated for a long time. Contempt not only for Helen as a person, but for the values we represent, for the honest work that built everything you now so comfortably enjoy. You're misinterpreting, Claire began, but I raised a hand to stop her predictable justification. I'm not finished, I said, with a calm that contrasted with the storm I felt inside. The truly revealing thing wasn't your words, Claire. It was my son's silence. His inaction as he witnessed this treatment of the woman who brought him into the world, who sacrificed countless personal opportunities to support his growth, who has been the heart of our family and company for decades. I looked at Daniel again, who was now avoiding my gaze. That silence, my son, speaks louder than any word you could say now. Dad, he tried again, his voice now tinged with urgency. You're jumping to extreme conclusions based on one isolated incident. Our relationship, both family and professional, is too important to let one unfortunate moment define it. It's not an isolated moment, Daniel, I corrected. It's the culmination of a pattern that has been developing for years. A pattern where you have gradually allowed superficial, external values to replace the foundations you were raised on, where prestigious social connections became more important than authentic relationships, where the appearance of success began to outweigh the integrity of the process to achieve it. A tense silence followed my words. I could see Daniel's mind working quickly, calculating implications, evaluating response strategies, considering potential consequences for his professional and personal plans. What do you mean exactly? He finally asked, his tone cautious. That the time has come to clarify certain realities, I replied. Realities that I have been postponing out of hope, out of paternal love, out of a desire to believe that you would eventually remember the fundamental values you grew up with. I turned to Helen, whose expression revealed she sensed the gravity of what I was about to say. She nodded almost imperceptibly. That silent gesture that for 4 decades had meant, I am with you, whatever path you choose. Starting tomorrow, I continued, turning my attention back to Daniel and Claire, I am implementing significant changes to the operational and financial structure of Valley Developers. Changes I should have made long ago, when the first signs of this deviation from our values began to show. What kind of changes? Daniel asked, dropping all pretense of conciliation, his tone now openly worried. The specific details will be discussed in an appropriately professional context, I replied. For now, you just need to know that the accelerated transition you have been implementing is stopping immediately. I am resuming full control of all strategic and financial decisions, pending further evaluation. You can't do that, Claire exclaimed, her facade of cordiality completely abandoned. Daniel has legitimate rights as the designated CEO. There are contracts, agreements, expectations set with partners and investors. Claire is right, Daniel intervened, his voice mixing outrage with a barely contained hint of panic. You can't just reverse years of planned transition over a personal disagreement. There are legal, professional, reputational implications. Precisely why the documents Helen brought are so important, I replied with unshakable calm. Review them carefully. You'll see that the transition was always conditioned on specific clauses that preserved my final authority in strategic decisions. Clauses that include not only financial, but ethical considerations. Daniel's expression changed subtly as he processed this information. He knew exactly which clauses I was referring to. We had discussed them extensively during the initial planning of the transition, although he had evidently considered them legal formalities with no real intention of implementation. "This is absurd," Claire intervened again. "You can't halt the company's progress because of an emotional tantrum. The new partners, the connections we've established, the opportunities we've created, everything will be compromised." "What has been compromised?" I replied, my voice acquiring an edge I rarely allowed to surface, "are the fundamental values that built this company. Unconditional integrity. Genuine respect for every person regardless of their position or apparent utility. Gratitude toward those who helped build what we now enjoy." I headed toward the door with Helen firmly by my side. I paused briefly before leaving, turning one last time toward my son. "Daniel," I said, my tone softer now but no less determined, "you will always be my son, and you will always have a place in my heart. But actions have consequences, and silence in the face of injustice is itself a powerful action. Reflect deeply on the man you are choosing to be, on the values you are prioritizing, on the true legacy you are building beyond appearances and superficial connections." Without waiting for a response, we left. The afternoon sun bathed the elegant garden of that house that had been our gift, a symbol of trust and hope in the future. As I helped Helen into the car, I noticed her hand was no longer trembling. Her posture had regained that serene dignity that had always characterized her. "Are you sure about what you're going to do?" she asked softly as we drove away. "Completely," I replied. "I should have done it long ago when the first signs became obvious. But it's never too late to stand up for what truly matters." She placed her hand on mine. That simple gesture that for 4 decades had meant more than 1,000 words. "I'm with you," she said simply, "whatever path we decide to take now." And as I drove home, I felt a strange mixture of pain and clarity. Pain for what I was losing, or perhaps for recognizing what I had already lost some time ago, but absolute clarity about what I had to protect. Not just a material estate built with decades of honest work, but the fundamental values that gave it true meaning. The battle ahead would be difficult, likely painful for everyone involved. But as long as I had Helen by my side, as long as we held on to that moral compass that had guided us our entire lives, we would face any challenge with the same determination and dignity that had brought us this far. What I didn't know at that moment, as we returned home in a silence filled with shared resolution, was that events would unfold with a speed and direction that not even I, with all my experience and foresight, could have fully anticipated. That same night, as soon as we got home, I set in motion the plan I had been considering as a contingency for months, but which I never thought I would actually need to implement. A series of calls to key people, precise instructions, documents that had been kept in my personal safe, waiting for a moment I had secretly hoped would never come. Martin Smith, our CFO, came to the house immediately. On the study table, we spread out the documents that would detail the emergency restructuring of Valley developers. "Are you sure about this, Richard?" Martin asked, after reviewing the scope of the proposed changes. "This is a very drastic intervention." "Absolutely sure," I replied. "The problems you detected are just symptoms of something deeper that has been developing. Today, I had the definitive confirmation that the situation is unsustainable." I didn't go into personal details, keeping our discussion strictly professional. Martin, always discreet, didn't ask further than what was necessary to implement the required measures. Helen, meanwhile, contacted our closest circle of trust. Robert Miller, our legal director who had been with the company almost from the beginning, Laura Taylor, our HR director whose loyalty was unquestionable, and David King, our head of operations, who knew every project and every team like the back of his hand. By 11 p.m. I had my key team assembled at my house, all aware of the gravity of the situation, though not its personal details, all willing to work through the night to implement the necessary changes before the offices opened the next day. "Protocol Eagle is implemented effective immediately," I announced. using the code name we had established years ago for an emergency restructuring. Martin, I need full control restored over all corporate accounts and a temporary suspension of any transaction over $100,000 without my personal signature. It's already in process, Richard, he confirmed. The banks have been notified according to the established protocols. By 9 a.m. tomorrow, everything will be implemented. Robert, I need you to send formal notifications to all partners and major clients about the temporary change in management structure, emphasizing operational continuity and financial stability. I have the documents prepared, Robert replied. I just need your final review before distributing them first thing in the morning. Laura, we need a general meeting with all administrative staff tomorrow at 10 a.m. No exceptions. Understood. I'll send the summons tonight. David, I want complete reports on every active project, with special emphasis on those initiated in the last 6 months. I need to understand exactly what commitments have been made and with whom. By noon tomorrow, you will have the full report on your desk, David confirmed. We reviewed additional details for another hour, anticipating potential obstacles, preparing answers for inevitable questions, ensuring that the transition, though abrupt, was as professional and orderly as possible. When everyone had left, around 1 in the morning, Helen found me in the study, looking at the family photograph I kept on my desk. Us with Daniel at his college graduation. Genuine smiles, shared pride, hope for the future. Do you think he will try to fight back? She asked softly, placing a cup of tea in front of me. Without a doubt, I replied. The question is how, and with what intensity? And are we prepared for that? Professionally, yes. The measures implemented are legally solid. Emotionally, I left the sentence unfinished, unable to fully articulate the pain of being in this position, facing the son who had been the center of our hopes and plans. Helen took my hand, that simple gesture that for decades had been our shared anchor in difficult times. We are acting from integrity, Richard, she said with that quiet clarity I had always admired in her. Not for revenge, not for control, but to protect what we built with honest work and genuine values. Whatever the outcome, we can face it with a clear conscience. I know, I replied, gently squeezing her hand. That's what gives me the strength to do what's necessary, even if it's the hardest thing I've ever faced. We barely slept that night, each of us processing the day's events in our own way and preparing for what was to come. At 6 in the morning, we were already up, having a light breakfast before heading to the office. For the first time in years, Helen decided to accompany me. My place is with you today, she said simply, when I suggested she might prefer to stay home, away from the inevitable drama that was approaching. We arrived at the Valley Developers headquarters at 7:30, intentionally early to establish ourselves before the staff arrived. The building, an elegant contemporary design that combined functionality with refined aesthetics, had been one of our proudest projects, reflecting the values of solidity and vision we had always tried to represent. Laura Taylor was already waiting for us, with the main conference room prepared for the general meeting. Martin Smith arrived minutes later, confirming that all financial measures were implemented as planned. The banks have confirmed the temporary restrictions, he reported. Any movement above the specified amount will require your personal authorization. Have there been any attempted transactions since yesterday? I asked, anticipating possibilities. 3 attempts at significant transfers, all automatically rejected according to the implemented protocol. The information confirmed my suspicions. Daniel, likely advised by Claire and possibly her father, had tried to move funds quickly before the restrictions took full effect. Fortunately, our immediate action had prevented this. At 8:45, as I was reviewing the final documents with Robert, my phone began to ring insistently. Daniel. I decided not to answer for the moment. This conversation needed to happen face to face, not filtered through technology that could dilute the necessary intensity. At 9:15, the tension in the office was palpable. Employees arrived, immediately sensing that something significant was happening. Helen's presence, so rare in recent years, drew curious but respectful glances. The trusted executives were already at their posts, discreetly implementing the instructions received during the night. At 9:30, exactly what I had anticipated happened. Daniel appeared at the reception, accompanied not only by Claire, but also by two men I recognized as legal advisors associated with his father-in-law's conglomerate. His expression wavered between barely contained fury and a calculated determination. The receptionist, previously instructed, notified me immediately of their arrival. "Show them to the secondary meeting room," I instructed. "I'll be with them in 5 minutes." Helen looked at me, a silent question in her eyes. "I'd prefer you weren't present for this initial confrontation," I told her softly. "Not because you can't handle it, but because you shouldn't have to face that level of hostility again." "I'm fine, Richard," she replied firmly. "My place is by your side, especially now." Her determination moved me deeply. After 42 years together, she could still surprise me with her inner strength. "Then let's face it together," I nodded, offering her my arm as we headed toward the battle that awaited us. Upon entering the meeting room, the tension was so thick you could almost touch it. Daniel stood up immediately, his posture openly confrontational. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, holding up his phone where, presumably, he had received notifications of the restrictions. "Frozen accounts? Suspension of executive authority? Notifications to partners about a temporary restructuring?" "Good morning to you too, son," I replied, with a calm that clearly threw him off for a moment. "Gentlemen," I added, addressing the lawyers present, "welcome to Valley Developers. If you are here in a professional capacity, I would appreciate it if you formally stated who you represent before we continue." This simple professional protocol, implemented with perfect courtesy but absolute firmness, created the first strategic imbalance. The lawyers, clearly not prepared for this approach, exchanged uncomfortable glances. "We are advising Daniel," one of them finally replied, avoiding specifying his exact affiliation. "I understand," I nodded. "In that case, I must inform you that this is an internal family and corporate meeting. Any formal legal communication should be directed to our legal department through established channels." "Dad, this is ridiculous," Daniel intervened, his frustration evident. "We don't need formalities. We need to immediately reverse these measures before they cause irreparable damage to the company and our business relationships." "On the contrary," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly controlled. "In situations of this nature, clarity and formality are essential to avoid further misunderstandings. And speaking of misunderstandings, would you care to explain the 3 attempts at significant transfers made after our conversation yesterday?" His expression revealed he didn't expect this level of specific information. Claire, who until then had maintained a calculated silence, intervened with obvious irritation. "Standard business operations, part of the projects in development," she replied with that condescending tone she had perfected. "Projects that are now at risk because of these impulsive and emotionally motivated measures." "Interesting description," I commented, pulling out a folder I had carefully prepared, "because according to our records, these specific transfers do not correspond to any project officially documented in our systems. Could you clarify exactly what standard business operations require transfers to entities in Panama that are not listed in any of our active contracts?" The silence that followed was telling. Daniel turned visibly pale while Claire tensed her posture, exchanging a significant look with the lawyers. "I see this has turned into some kind of hostile audit," Daniel finally said, trying to regain his footing. "If so, we should continue this discussion with full legal representation present." "It's not a hostile audit," Helen corrected, speaking for the first time, her voice surprisingly firm. "It's an expression of basic fiduciary responsibility. The same responsibility we taught you since you were a boy and started learning about the family business." The mention of these fundamental values, especially coming from Helen, seemed to affect Daniel more deeply than any technical or legal argument I could have made. For a brief moment, I saw something in his eyes that reminded me of the idealistic young man he had once been. A spark of recognition, perhaps even shame. But then Claire placed her hand on his arm, a gesture seemingly of support that also seemed to work as an anchor, a reminder of current loyalties over past connections. "We didn't come here to discuss business philosophies," she said, dropping all pretense of friendliness. "We came to inform you that these unilateral actions will have significant consequences, not just for the company, but for you personally." "Is that a threat, Claire?" Helen asked, her tone reflecting genuine curiosity rather than intimidation. "It's a business reality," Claire replied. "The connections we've established, the commitments we've made, the plans that are in motion, they aren't just projects that can be frozen without repercussions. There are powerful people involved, expectations that have been set. Precisely why it was so important to implement proper controls, I replied. Because a company built on 4 decades of unwavering integrity cannot be compromised by powerful people whose expectations do not align with our fundamental values. Values, Claire exclaimed, her frustration finally boiling over completely. Always these grandiose words: tradition, integrity, sacrifice. The real world runs on effective connections, on seized opportunities, on calculated risks. The world you describe, Helen replied, with a calm that contrasted sharply with Claire's agitation, is precisely the one we have consciously chosen not to inhabit our entire lives. A world where the end justifies any means, where relationships are valued only for their immediate utility, where success is measured exclusively in material terms. And look where that outdated vision has gotten you, Claire retorted with obvious disdain. A respectable but provincial company, when you could have been an international conglomerate. Settling for safe projects, when you could have been in the major leagues. Mediocre satisfaction, when you could have had real power. Her words revealed, more clearly than any financial or legal evidence, the true gap in values that separated our visions. It wasn't just a difference in business strategies or management styles. It was a fundamental discrepancy in the very definition of success, of a life well lived, of a valuable legacy. I looked at my son, searching his eyes for any sign that he recognized this discrepancy, that perhaps he didn't fully share the mercenary vision his wife had just articulated so brazenly. What I saw left me momentarily speechless. There was no obvious moral conflict, no visible internal struggle, just practical determination, evaluation of options, calculation of possibilities. Daniel, I said finally, looking at him directly, is this really the vision you now share? That everything we built for decades represents mediocrity because we prioritized integrity over expansion at any cost? That the values we tried to instill in you are outdated obstacles instead of essential foundations? His answer, when it finally came, confirmed what I had already begun to accept in my heart. The son we had raised with so much love and hope had been replaced by someone I barely recognized. "Dad," he said, in a deliberately measured tone, "I greatly respect what you built, but the world has changed fundamentally. Today's opportunities require flexibility, audacity, strategic connections that maybe don't always align perfectly with traditional paradigms of operation. In other words," I said, "the ends justify the means, if those ends are ambitious enough." "You're oversimplifying," he protested. "On the contrary," I replied, "I'm clarifying the essential. And that clarity, though painful, is exactly what we needed to make the right decisions now." I stood up, indicating that the meeting was over from my perspective. The measures implemented will remain in effect indefinitely. Any attempt to circumvent them will result in immediate legal action, regardless of family ties. The general meeting, scheduled for 10 a.m., will proceed as planned, establishing the new operational structure for all employees. "This isn't over," Claire warned as she stood up, her posture openly hostile. "You have a very limited idea of who you are up against." "On the contrary," Helen replied, rising with that serene dignity that had always been her most notable characteristic. "We understand perfectly the nature of this confrontation. It's not with powerful people or influential connections. It's with fundamentally incompatible values, and on that ground, our position is absolutely clear and unshakable." As we left the room, leaving Daniel, Claire, and their legal advisors to evaluate their options, I felt a strange mixture of pain and liberation. Pain, for the definitive confirmation that I had lost my son to influences that had fundamentally transformed his character. Liberation, for the clarity I had finally reached, for the determination that this clarity generated. "Are you okay?" Helen asked softly as we walked toward the main conference room, where the staff was beginning to gather. "No," I answered honestly, "but I am at peace with what we must do now, and that is enough for this moment." She squeezed my hand briefly. That simple gesture that for 4 decades had communicated more than any words could express. Then, with shoulders straight and a serene expression, we entered the room together to communicate the changes that would transform not only our company's structure, but the future of everything we had built. The path opening before us would undoubtedly be difficult, probably painful, but also clearly necessary. And as I watched Helen walking with dignity by my side, I knew with absolute certainty that together, as we had always been, we would find the strength to walk it completely. The general meeting proceeded with the dignity and professionalism that had always characterized Valley developers. With Helen by my side, I explained the structural changes without going into personal or family details. I emphasized operational continuity, unwavering commitment to employees and clients, and a return to the fundamental values that had built our reputation for decades. These adjustments, I concluded, do not represent a step backward, but a recentering on our true identity, on who we are, on what we represent, on how we build not just buildings, but lasting relationships based on genuine trust. The following days confirmed what I already anticipated. Daniel and Claire would not give up easily. As they had warned, they tried to use powerful connections to pressure us. Calls from influential politicians, hints of possible regulatory complications, even subtle threats of media exposure of supposed historical irregularities in the company. They're firing blanks. Robert Miller, our legal director, commented after analyzing every threat received. They have no real evidence of irregularities because they simply don't exist. 4 decades of transparent operations are not dismantled with unfounded insinuations. The pressure peaked 3 weeks later when Daniel, clearly advised by his father-in-law, tried one last desperate move. He leaked a narrative to certain local media of a corporate coup where an aging founder, resistant to change, had sabotaged the modernization efforts of the new generation out of pure egocentrism. The strategy failed spectacularly. Our reputation for integrity was too solidly established in the community. Employees, suppliers, and clients from decades past came out publicly in our defense, not out of blind loyalty, but from direct experience with our values in action. In parallel, the exhaustive audit we had initiated revealed the true extent of the plans we had interrupted. Questionable financial schemes, commitments to entities of dubious reputation, and even preparations for a restructuring that would have eventually diluted us completely from the control of the company we had founded. "It's worse than we imagined," Martin confessed, presenting me with the detailed results. A few more months, and it would have been irreversible. 6 weeks after that fateful afternoon where I heard Claire yell, "Get out of here, you crazy old woman." At my Helen, I received an unexpected request. Daniel, asking for a private meeting. Just him. No Claire, no lawyers, no predetermined agendas. "Do you think it's sincere?" I asked Helen as we considered the request. "I don't know," she answered honestly, "but we always taught him to give second chances. We can't ask him to remember our values if we ourselves forget them when it's difficult to maintain them." The meeting took place on neutral ground, a small cafe where we used to take Daniel when he was a boy. He arrived alone, visibly tired, without the arrogance that had characterized his recent appearances. "Thank you for coming," he began, his voice revealing a vulnerability he hadn't shown in years. "I know I probably don't deserve this chance after everything that's happened." "I'm listening," I replied simply, maintaining a genuine openness without premature reconciliation. What followed was an honest conversation, the likes of which we hadn't had in years. No elaborate justifications, no shifting of blame, just an honest admission of questionable decisions made gradually, of influences he had allowed to dominate him, of values he had pushed aside in pursuit of a distorted vision of success and status. "I don't expect to immediately regain your trust or my position," he concluded after almost 2 hours. "I just wanted you to know that I'm finally seeing clearly what you tried to show me for so long." "And Claire?" I asked, the inevitable question. "We're done," he replied simply. "Some differences are irreconcilable when you finally see them with total honesty. I didn't offer instant reconciliation or automatic restoration of privileges. That would have been condescending to him and dishonest with myself. Instead, I offered something I considered more valuable, a genuine opportunity for gradual reconstruction based on consistent actions, not on emotional words of the moment. The road back will be long, I warned, and it will require constant demonstration, not just occasional declarations. "I understand," he nodded, "and I'm willing to walk it completely, step by step, with no shortcuts." As we said goodbye, I felt something I had feared was lost forever, a spark of genuine hope, not naive, not blind to the challenges that remained, but grounded in the real possibility of an authentic, eventual, though not immediate, reconnection. 6 months after that day, I heard my daughter-in-law scream at my wife. Valley Developers has found a new equilibrium. Under a shared leadership where experience and fresh vision coexist respectfully, where fundamental values and necessary adaptation are not opposing forces but complementary ones, where success is measured not only in financial results, but in genuine human impact. Daniel, starting over from basic positions, is gradually rebuilding not just his career, but his personal integrity. The road is long, and there are scars that will probably never fully disappear. But there is also a renewed authenticity in our interactions, an honesty that we might not have reached without the crisis that forced us to face painful but necessary truths. Helen and I, meanwhile, have begun to implement the transition we always envisioned. Gradual, planned, respectful of everyone involved. Not because of external pressure or forced circumstances, but by conscious choice based on consistent values. That afternoon when I heard Claire yell, "Get out of here, you crazy old woman!" at my wife, I didn't know I was witnessing not only a painful family crisis, but also an unexpected opportunity. The opportunity to reaffirm with decisive actions, not just occasional words, which values are truly non-negotiable in our lives. Because in the end, what we stand for in critical moments defines who we really are. Not our statements in times of calm, but our actions when our fundamental values are directly challenged. And if there is one lesson these turbulent months have taught me, it is that it's never too late to defend what truly matters. To set clear boundaries based not on control or power, but on fundamental respect and unwavering dignity. To demonstrate with decisive actions, not just eloquent words, what kind of people we choose to be when we face the most difficult tests. My daughter-in-law yelled at my wife, "Get out of here, you crazy old woman!" not knowing I was behind the door, listening to every word. And in that painful, clarifying moment, I found the determination to defend not only the woman who has been my unconditional partner for 4 decades, but the fundamental values we have tried to live and pass on together throughout our shared life. Because in the end, the only thing we truly possess is not our material achievements or social positions, but the integrity with which we face every challenge, and the dignity with which we defend what we truly love.